All right. Well, wow. Still more people in the waiting room. I got to tell you, I'm feeling a little nervous. My energy this morning was more like, I'm going to hang out with 12 or 15 people and chat. But here we are climbing towards 70 participants. What a joy. I hope that, I can't wait to see what gets uncovered here. I'm going to introduce myself in 1 second. I want to invite people to throw in the chat, to type in the chat if the chat is accessible for you. What comes up when you hear the word obligation? Thanks, Sasha. I'll talk more about the launch in a few minutes. What comes up for you when you hear the word obligation? And if the chat isn't accessible for you, I want to invite you to unmute yourselves and share. Take a second and as you're putting things in and as folks are putting things in, take a moment and read through what folks are sharing here. An opportunity, but also a responsibility, an action undertaken regardless of desire, responsibility, time-bound mitzvot. I saw mitzvot earlier. I saw guilt earlier. Duty, action, responsibility, fulfillment, structures and barriers, homework. All right. There is a lot beneath the word obligation. And we're going to bring it here a little bit in a general context and in the context of halacha, of Jewish law. I want to take a second before we dig any deeper just to introduce myself. My name is Becky Silverstein. I use the pronouns he, him, his. I'm a rabbi based in Boston, Massachusetts, unceded Massachusetts land. Before I say anything else about myself, I'll say that I have a 16-and-a-half-month-old that some of you have met. And while my house has lots of space, it is short on doors. So if you see me reaching down, or if you hear something, or if I pick her up, that will be what it will be, as it is these days. I do lots of things as a rabbi, happy to talk more about so many of them. And I'm coming to you today in particular from the launch of the Trans Halakhah Project. The Trans Halakhah Project, I'm going to share more about in the opening session, so I won't say a lot here, but I will say it's going to be housed at Sfara. I'm a fellow at Sfara and also on the Sfara board, and will curate and bring together resources that trans folks that we are already making for ourselves, and help collect some of that powerful work and hopefully create new paradigms for halacha and new tshuvot, and bring into the world a new way for folks to engage with Jewish law in a way that centers our experience and uplifts our dignity. We're at the very beginning of this project. I'm super excited about where it's going to go. And I'll say one more thing, which is foundational, and then we're going to go into breakout groups, and then we'll come back and we'll do that a few times. I want to share one more thing that is foundational to this session and to the work of the Trans Halakhah Project, which is a core assumption that if when I say we today, not everyone here is trans-identified. I've opened this session to trans folks and cisgender allies. But when I say we today, I mean trans folks. So this assumption that if we want to, we can be part of the community that for whom halacha is a guide, for whom Jewish law is a guide. If we want to be, we can be obligated to the mitzvot. If we want to engage, we can. And the question then isn't, are we obligated? Although that's a perfectly valid question. And I know folks in this room who are asking that, but how are we obligated? How can we find ourselves to be obligated? And what do we need to do to halacha? And what do we need to do for our practice to find a place that speaks fully to who we are in the Jewish community. So in order to do that, though, I'm assuming some sense of wanting to be part of that system. And Jewish law is a system of obligation. We're fulfilling those laws for a reason. So before I go any further, let's give you all a chance to chat with each other. So we're going to split into breakout groups. They're going to be groups of 3 or 4, and would love for you to share an experience of obligation. Introduce yourselves, say hi, and then an experience of obligation being fulfilled, maybe, or not fulfilled. Actually, doesn't have to be in a Jewish context. Sound good? Okay, and we are going to go random here. We're going to jump in. We're going to assign automatically. Well, one breakout room would be insufficient. That's funny that that's even an option. Okay, and you are going to have, let's say, 4 minutes. I'm going to hit the close breakout rooms button at 10 after the hour. You should take that full 60 seconds though. Ready? Go. Oop, go. Okay, Robin and Ori and Cindy, I assume that you all are listening somewhere. If you need help getting into a breakout room, let us know. And if not, not.
Some folks may be added to rooms.
All good. Folks who are just coming in, folks, just hang tight actually for the next 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll call everyone back together. So one more time, welcome to all y'all signing in. We are in an initial round of breakout groups that's going to close in 2 to 3 minutes. And I want to invite you then, while you're here, to put in the chat either an association that comes up when you hear the word obligation, or a story or you can unmute yourself and share a story about a time in which you engaged with obligation of some sorts. Welcome to those who just joined. Hang tight for just a minute as folks will be coming back from breakout rooms. Mhm. Thanks, Leah. All right. Looks like y'all made it back okay through the airwaves there, and then a few extra folks, you're not extra, a few more folks joined our learning this morning. I want to invite you to put in the chat something that came up in your small group, whether it had to do with my prompt of sharing an experience of, that involved obligation or not. Would love to get a sense of what the starting conversation was. Cats. Yeah. Well, that's unsurprising. Okay. I'm going to just highlight a couple, and apologies if I don't highlight yours or if I highlight the same person's. I'm not tracking it as sometimes I do in other learning sessions here. The positive and negative aspects of obligation. Aspects, and maybe also even positive and negative emotions that come up. A sense of freedom within obligation. This question of what things are flexible and what things are non-negotiables. Right, Rachel is sharing that during COVID, they are flexible with tech on Shabbos, but saving a human life and caring for a neighbor isn't negotiable. And in fact, right, pikuach nefesh, saving a human life isn't negotiable in the biggest context, right? In the biggest, in all of Jewish context, in terms of obligations. Obligations in tension with each other and a sense of purpose. Obligation doesn't have to be reciprocal. Wow, thank you all for putting these things up here. There's so much to dig into. I want to say that, right, one way obligation or what halacha is, what Jewish law is, right, is an expression in some ways of obligation. Do we follow these laws or don't? Do we feel bound to follow them or don't we, and which ones and why? I'm really interested in the why. Here's a little bit about why I'm interested in the why. I'm interested in the why because I didn't grow up in a household that talked about halakha, that talked about Jewish law. And I came to Jewish practice, I don't know, on my own, right? And outside of family context. Now the family, my spouse and my kiddo and I, we have our Jewish home, which is halachic in nature. And I have people in my chosen family and certainly in my extended communities for whom halacha is a relative or relevant framework. But it isn't what I grew up with, and it didn't come naturally to me. And even more so as I struggled to figure out as I struggled along my own gender journey to ultimately figuring out, right, what it meant to be non-binary and to identify as genderqueer, also to identify as transmasculine. I wasn't sure where I fit in any of these questions. So I didn't know where I fit, but then also because I sort of didn't grow up with things, I didn't have a reflex towards Jewish law. And so when I decide to take on a particular commandment, to what am I accountable and what's my motivation for doing it? And it turns out I'm really bad at daily practice, at keeping up daily practice. It's not my forte of some sort. But knowing why, knowing that for me, right, that putting on tefillin is an expression of obligation to myself, right, to grounding myself in Jewish tradition is helpful. And knowing that I keep a kosher home out of obligation to both my own love of Torah and my understanding of those laws, but also to the folks in my community whom I want to have in my house. That obligation to community is also really deep and meaningful for me. And occasionally I find a moment where I fulfill some sort of commandment, some sort of mitzvah, because of my obligation to God, to the divine. But I'll tell you, all 90 of you, that, so I guess it's not such a secret that happens less than the other two for me. And I feel okay about it, if a little bit shy. But here we go. I have landed us halfway into my lesson, or halfway into my shiur outline, without going into a fundamental thing that I wanted to start with. So we are going to take, for what feels like for me, a 10-minute step back here. If obligation is expressed through halakha, and halakha is about the action of doing mitzvot, then we're going to start by talking about mitzvot and what those are. Anyone want to throw in the chat the root of the word mitzvot? Blessing, good guess. Bracha is the Hebrew word for blessing. The Hebrew root, there we go. Amina's got it. Tzadi vav hey. I'm sorry, or tzadi vav yud. Hey and yud are weak letters that are sometimes interchangeable. And so if you were to look up the word mitzvot in Jastro, the classical dictionary used to study rabbinic text, you could look it up on its own as mitzvot and you would get commandment. Or as we like to do in Sfara land to find the core meaning of words, we might also look up the root of that word. All Hebrew words have roots. The vast majority of them are 3-letter roots. Every once in a while, you get a 2-letter root or a 4-letter root. Olivia just cut and pasted the link to the online Jastro dictionary in the chat. Thank you, Olivia. So, Tzadi vav yud, tzadi vav hey, and it means to order, I skipped the first meaning here, to join, to attend, or to arrange. To join, to attend, or to arrange. So some of you are nodding. I can only see, 25 of you or so. I'm curious what that might add to our understanding of what a commandment is. You can either put something in the chat, or you can, and here's the next set of definitions: to order, to command, to appoint, or you can unmute yourself. Like Tzibor, I think Tzibor's root is tzadi bet resh, but Sarifiyu needs to be looked into. Let's put a sticky on it, as my teacher, Rabbi B'nai Lappy, likes to say. Something that guides our attention to ensure connection. Thank you, Azaria. Actions that connect us. I saw Olivia put in earlier. Char is sharing that one of their most surprising things they've learned since digging into the Sfara world is how many words mean to join or to attend in some way. Indeed, indeed, that the Hebrew language seems to be littered with a desire for us to be in connection and in community. From Itai, a way to relate to goddess or spirit or God. So then mitzvot are a way of connecting. And so perhaps our sense of obligation is to upholding that connection, right? It's not about doing a particular action. It's about staying in connection with whom. And I've already alluded a little bit to who the whom is. And I would put, I think there are probably more. If you have something else to add to this, by all means, put it in the chat. To ourselves, to God, and to community. Anything else we might want to stay connected to? Here's a fourth, to Jewish tradition. Great. So we've got to time. Ooh. Okay. To ourselves, God, community, tradition, time. Ourselves, community, God, tradition, time. Ooh, nature, the world we live in. And I wonder, these are not, I just typed those into the chat. These are not all mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for example, Azaria, thank you for putting in, right, that community includes ancestors and descendants, right? If that's sort of at the intersection in my mind of community and tradition. Maybe not for some of you, right? We can float. So to whom do you feel obligated? And do you feel obligated? To whom do you feel obligated? And do you feel obligated? Those are the two questions. So I am going to put you into pairs, maybe groups of 3, and give you maybe 2 minutes each to just answer those questions. When you come back, we'll turn to some sources. That's the plan. Good plan? Good plan.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, please.
I think you're working with an assumption that halacha and mitzvot are related to obligation.
Yes.
And I understand why, of course, right? But I'm kind of wondering about it. Like, is it necessary?
Yeah, great. Is it necessary? No, maybe not. I love that question, right? I think I'm working under the assumption that in order to that we all have motivations for performing mitzvot, and that those motivations might have to do with obligation. I would say, I think you are correct in your framing. I want to say that more strongly. I have to pause to say might, but I want to say tie back to a sense of obligation. And I would love, actually, let's take a second, Uriel, whether it's you or someone else. I'm curious if someone has another motivation for fulfilling mitzvot, and if we can wind our way back to obligation. Let's just test my hypothesis for 1 minute, maybe 2. Oh, Sarah Hirshhorn, I see your hand. Go for it.
I follow them out of tradition, especially like someone who wasn't raised very religiously Jewish. Part of the reason I connect to it is through tradition and being closer to my ancestors.
Great. So out of tradition and being closer to your ancestors. So you, Sarah, said those things. You also named that obligation is religious language in some way. And so I also want to pull that up actually into the list of things that I'm assuming. I had also assumed that I would be able to tie those things back to obligation. And while I think I could in a somewhat long-winded and probably diluted rabbi way, I'm not going to. So let's sit. I'm going to sit with that. Great. I've learned many things, but yes, who else is unmuting? I cannot see you.
Yeah, I'm Leia. You said them pronouns.
Perfect, Leia.
Thinking about for me, and I think this like is in relationship with obligation, but as of right now, it feels more like experimentation. Like I want to connect to this tradition, but I don't feel an obligation, and so I'm like trying things on, and they feel nice for those reasons of connecting to people, to God, to whatever, but it doesn't have yet for me a relationship to obligation.
Perfect.
Or it's like tension with obligation.
Yeah, I love that, right? I love that doing mitzvot can be part of an exploration of any number of things, in particular how we're in relationship with Jewish tradition. I think also I'm putting a frame of obligation on it as well, because I want to talk about halacha. I want to talk about Jewish law. And right, law necessitates, I think, talking about something that we have to do, or something for which there's consequences if we do or don't do it. But now I'm wavering. So I'm going to waver, and I'm going to break you out into groups to chat for 2 minutes each, where you personally are sitting with obligation. Sound good? Okay, here we go. Nope, we're going to recreate. There are a lot of people here, folks. There we go. Here you go. Have fun. Sasha, did you get bumped, or you're just hanging here?
It was an empty breakout room.
Oh no. Well, great. Folks who are here, let's share a little. Now we're in a nice cozy group of 12. If you feel up for it, we'd love to hear 1 or 2 folks.
I'll share. Although it's recording, but I guess that's okay. I haven't thought about obligation in a long time in terms of mitzvot. I've been thinking about it in the terms of ritual, and the idea, kind of stealing from Judith Butler, in this performance, and the repetition of the performance is what makes something more real and more personal. She talks about it as gender, and in my brain, using Jewish ritual and the performance of it and the repetition of it becomes more and more part of your being. Thanks
for that. Is it really a gathering of queer and trans folks if Judith Butler isn't brought up? Is my first question.
Only if you're not doing it right.
I also want to thank you for pulling up the one piece of Judith Butler that I understand. Yeah, great. There's a repetition and a performance to it.
Which doesn't get us to halacha, but
yeah,
I want to make the leap to halacha from that somehow.
Yeah, I love that question. Right. I'm feeling more and more like a halacha evangelist right now than something else, for sure. Would someone else want to share a little bit about your relationship to obligation?
I can go.
Thank you.
So I have a hard relationship with it. I think similar to, I don't want to repeat of the framework that a lot of people are in with like ritual and tradition being more their vibe, because I think a challenging thing that I feel towards, I was the one who put in the chat that I feel guilt. So I'm trying to practice halakha out of a place of wanting to actually do it and of feeling joy and meaning. And I think it's hard for me to do that when I was brought up in a very more people are joining. Hi, friends. A very like traditional Jewish community where it was like, if you don't follow all these things and you don't do it right, then you are a bad Jew. And it's really bad for me to get out of that framework. So I think it then leads me to go to the other extreme of I don't want to follow it at all because I don't want to feel guilty and don't want to do these things for the wrong reasons.
Rachel, I'm sitting with your last piece, for the wrong reasons. I mean, thank you. I'm sitting with all of it and for your vulnerable sharing. And I'm very curious, Elijah, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to call everyone back in a moment. I'm very curious what the wrong reasons to do mitzvot might be. I'm actually going to call folks back now, as we seem to have a plethora of folks who were bumped. But anyone else, who else has something that you'd be up for sharing, knowing that folks are going to start popping back in? Anyone else feeling brave? All right.
I can share something super briefly, which is
Thanks,
just
Yoni.
like, I've been thinking a lot about sort of how we choose the things that like we choose to take these actions or not take them. Ultimately, it's our choice. So even when they feel like obligation, right? Like we're ultimately taking it on ourselves. And that is like a really weird place to be in ultimately, that like we're feeling obligated to something, but we also know that it's our choice. And how that then relates to like the more we do something, the more it feels like an obligation, or sort of those kinds of pieces of it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Yoni. Thanks to the folks in the larger group who shared, and for all of you who are coming back. Would love to have a couple of folks unmute. I'm really sitting in this place of like, do we want to be talking about obligation, or do we want to be talking about just mitzvot, and feeling like, oh, or do I really want to like give you sell you all on halakhah and why it's important in Jewish identity, which is not a thing that I'm going to do. That is not what you signed up for, and it's not what I want to do. Azari, thanks for lifting up that question. So yeah, are there 3 or 4 folks who would unmute and share? Share? Something? Yeah, Claire, I saw it. Did you just unmute? Go for it.
Yes, I'll jump in first. Okay, I will share what I shared in my breakout room, which is like really on my mind recently, which is that I was very much raised, I think, Jewishly to like in a Reform context with sort of this idea that any participation in Jewish life, in Jewish tradition or ritual or mitzvot or anything, like should be motivated by and sort of determined by what is meaningful to you as an individual, and like what feels good to you and what you enjoy doing. And I think recently I have found that to be a very limiting way of engaging with Judaism religiously, because like if I'm only ever doing what is already meaningful to me and what already feels good to me, then I'm not being challenged and I'm not being like pushed to grow in new directions outside of my comfort zone. And so I feel like I want the sense of obligation. I want some sense that my practice is coming from some place that is bigger than just like my ego and sort of my self. And at the same time, like I don't necessarily feel like I am sort of obligated like by the law of God to follow halakha in every particular. And so I'm not sure sort of theologically and philosophically like what the middle ground is, where I do feel like there's an obligation that's coming from someplace bigger than myself, but like also there's room for my own agency and my own boundaries and needs.
Thanks for sharing, Claire. We're going to go to Ori.
Claire, I resonate with that. And I also, obligation can feel to me sort of deadening, or not in alignment with agency. I'm polyam, and so I can have different kinds of relationships with different people. I'm not polyamorous about God, but I do sort of think that my relationship with God can take different forms, like in the way that you might have a comet, or like a person you meet at a party and have a beautiful encounter and then see, but you don't have like a consistency with. That can be great, but that's actually not the relationship I want with God. What I want with God is more consistent, and I want more interaction. And that means that like I have to be more consistent in my showing up with God if I want to have that kind of relationship. Like any other relationship, I only get out what I put into it, and I have to invest in it if I want it to be that kind of, to take up that kind of space in my life and be a resource for me.
Thanks, Ori. Okay, we're going to go Olivia and then Elizabeth, and then I'm going to share some thoughts.
Thank you for holding this conversation. I'm thinking about the ways in which each generation opt into continuing the covenant and the ways that consent plays into it, starting with Sinai and then maybe like at the end of the Purim story where we all consented to 4 new commandments, and then how it's sort of our obligation to create new obligations and keep on readapting, and just where the consent for all of these obligations comes from.
Thanks, Olivia. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
In my room we were kind of talking about how so I didn't really grow up with a strong religious tradition in my life. I came into actually practicing Judaism much later in my life, just a few years ago, really. And this kind of contrasts a lot with my previous life, where I was just horribly individualistic for a variety of reasons, but I don't even really know exactly what it is or how to put it into words, but just sometime within the last few years after, discovering I was trans, I just kind of had this shift from like just wanting to just be entirely independent, my own person kind of thing, to wanting some sort of anchor is the best way that I can think of to describe it. And kind of spinning off of what was mentioned before about consent is that I have this very complicated relationship, I feel, with the word obligation here in this context, because I do feel obligated to myself primarily, and it's a sort of obligation that I allow myself to have. And it's that the fact that I allow myself to have that obligation is very central to how I feel about this whole thing. So I guess consent, when Ori mentioned consent, I was like, oh, that's the word for this. It's because that is very important to me and how I relate to it.
Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Here's how I think about this, right? That obligation, right? One's chiyuv, right? Means an obligation. And in fact, right, has connotations rabbinically and biblically to being liable, right? For being guilty, right? For needing to bring a guilt offering to the temple, for example, or for being chayav mita, for being right, for doing something that would require you to be killed towards the death penalty. And then we have mitzvot, right, which we talked about are about joining. And I think my inclination to jump into mitzvot, which I think, right, are nice, people have been nicely characterizing as actions we take that join us to each other or to community or to God, right, that are about building relationship with any of those entities, also with tradition and the world we live in, and time came up, and an abundant number of things, is that, so I feel an inherent tension between this sense of obligation and guilt and this sense of deepening relationship. And yet the feeling that I have to be in relationship with myself or with God or with other people moves me tremendously. Why? In part, as Claire said, it provides impetus for growth, right? And the Hasidic masters are very fond of talking about the ways in which doing mitzvot bring us up a spiritual ladder. We could not like the metaphor of a spiritual ladder, maybe. We could problematize that, but that there's growthfulness in doing mitzvot. And so feeling obligated to these specific set of actions is one piece. I think also that obligation provides a container for me. It provides a fallback, right? A wall to lean against and saying, why, when I don't know why I'm doing something, to say, because I'm obligated to the Torah, because I am choosing in to this covenant that has been passed down through generations, and my opting in is what I want. What I want is to be a part. Of course, there's struggle there because often folks don't want me, right? I get a message that says like, I'm not a part, or this particular way of opting in, putting on tefillin or something else isn't for me, right? And so I think that's in some way where where questions of consent and questions of what do I want to do start to bubble up. What does it mean to opt in to a community of folks upholding mitzvot who may do me harm? The mitzvot themselves might even be harmful, right? If I am, I won't give one that might be triggering for folks in this group, so give me a second. The mitzvot themselves might be harmful. Let's leave it there. So what if we imagined a community held by a set of mutual values and a set of joint obligation to each other, where mitzvot were at the core? In other words, what if we imagined this group of people who were all obligated and playing the same spiritual game of fulfilling mitzvot and growing and witnessing and supporting each other's growth? What would each of us look like, and what would the world look like? And that is the hook. That is my obligation hook. What I want to share with you are a few texts that lead us in a couple of different directions. Two of them are folks, are Jewish, one of them is Abraham Joshua Heschel. We'll pull up the source sheet, you'll see the other. I'm going to put the link in the chat and screen share in a minute. Are folks who ask us, what's the point of doing mitzvot? And three of them are more classical texts. The contract of absolute. Yeah, we're going to go there and not into where I'm headed. So I'm going to put this link in the chat. First, I'm going to make sure it's accessible to all of you, which of course it wasn't. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so just catching up on the chat. Okay, open up this Google Doc if you can. If you can't, I'm going to screen share in just a moment. As soon as I make sure that when I share my screen, you won't see, nope, that's sharing options for you. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you all can just see a source sheet. Yes? Great. Where do we want to go? Oh, we have 4 minutes. We're going to stay right here on this first question of why do mitzvot? Throw some philosophy into the mix here, right? Let's get someone to unmute and read this aloud. First person, just do it. If it's 6 of you, I'll choose someone.
If mitzvot are service to God, they do not have to be intended or directed to man's needs. Every reason given for the mitzvot that bases itself on human needs voids the mitzvot of all religious meaning. For if the mitzvot are the expression of philosophic knowledge, or if they have any ethical content, or if they are meant to benefit society, or if they are meant to maintain the Jewish people, then they who perform them serve not God but themselves, their society, or their people. They do not serve God, but use the Torah of God for human benefit and as a means to satisfy human needs.
Thanks, Alex. Can we have 2 people to unmute and share a reflection? And then I'm going to end by sharing a reflection on this or a question you have about it.
I find it hard to conceive of a God who wants things like, wants me to like perform these particular rituals or whatever, but that there is a other people's needs that does something for other people, and therefore for God, if you're thinking of God as something that is in everyone.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Itai. Anyone else?
I'm having a hard time with disliking the Torah as a means of satisfying human needs. Maybe this is just like the Tikkun Olam reform community I grew up in, but like taking care of other people is such a central part of Judaism to me that what's bad about taking care of other people? What's bad about satisfying human needs?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. The reason I love this quote, and I don't think I can talk for 3 minutes about it, but we'll see. What I love about this is it lays out for me all of the reasons why I might want to fulfill mitzvot. I might want to fulfill mitzvot because they benefit society, right? Me personally, right? Why do I give tzedakah every week, right before Shabbos? Because it benefits society, right? Because they're meant to maintain the Jewish people. Yes, right? I study Torah because it's a means of maintaining Jewish tradition and the Jewish people and continuing our existence on this world. Right? Do I do them to serve God? I do them to connect to God. The language of service is hard for me. It may not be hard for some of us for other reasons, but theologically it doesn't resonate. But I do them to connect to God and to connect, to do all these things. And because I want to be a better person, right? The ethical content. Yes, I believe that being attuned to the world around me and to my own spiritual needs makes me a better human being. I also believe, and this is where obligation comes in, that I don't have the motivation necessarily to do all these things on my own. And that I, maybe because I've experienced harm, don't trust that other people are also coming to the performance of mitzvot or other things with these things at heart, whether it's just serving God or the rest of these things. And so it's hard to build relationship and to be in community. And so ultimately, what I want for me and what I want for you and what I want for the Jewish world is a sense of being so deeply in relationship with each other that regardless of whether or not we want to be, or how I'm feeling in any given day, there are a set of actions that draw us closer. And that for me, right, is obligation and mitzvot and halakha. Dave put in the chat a link to the Trans Halakhah Project, which is going to start by refining all the things that we talked about today. So thank you for being my workshop buddies in that. And also say, what are the ways in which we as trans people are being caused harm or are experiencing harm at the hands of this system that I want to be a thing that connects us to each other and to each other, to tradition, and to the greater Jewish community. Here's what I want you to do with the last 15 seconds. I would like you to, on a piece of paper, on your phone, in the chat, wherever, write down one question that you're thinking about, or one thing that you've learned. And with that, I have learned, I've learned a couple of the assumptions that I make coming into this around my own perspective and the ways in which I have and have not adequately addressed them in a wider framework of Jewish experience. And I am so thrilled to have had the opportunity to surface those with all of you. We are going to close this room and head into the main space. I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and you can always reach out for more. People are direct messaging me. Dave, don't close the room.
I won't.
There we go. Awesome. Happy learning. Learn good Torah. Ask good questions. See you in another session.